Most of us believe in giving money to charity, but how much should the government be giving on our behalf? Earlier this week, the Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell highlighted a change in strategy with the announcement that more of his budget will go to Afghanistan and that there will be a review of aid going to countries like India. Here's Giles with more.
The British people are generous. They respond in big ways to international calamities, be they volcanic eruptions, city-shattering earthquakes, island-scouring tidal waves, or famine and flood. Britain's government aid programme does this too, but is far less water tents and blankets, and much more projects helping the poor help themselves.
First of all, the UK should be proud, really proud, of the fact that the Department for International Development, UK Aid, is probably the most respected and most effective aid agency in the world, bar none.
What I think is less clearly understood is how much of the budget goes to what are called bilateral programs, helping individual countries in particular ways. Secondly, this is a huge chunk of it, what goes to the multilateral organisations? If aid this year is going to be about 9 billion, something around 40% probably will go to bodies like the IMF and the World Bank. And that's beyond most of our ken and our control, if you like.
But given now international aid is one of only two budgets ring-fenced, and the other, health, is way up recent polls of public priorities and aid is way down, there's a political dilemma, increasingly voiced by newspaper columnists and even former ministers.
If I see £300 million going to a country, another country in overseas aid, when it's got loads of cash on deposit and a trading surplus, and then education gets slashed in Britain, I begin to think, where are your priorities?
Can I urge my right honourable friend to ignore Simon Heffer when in today's Daily Telegraph he advocates the complete abolition of DIPID on the basis that charity begins at home.
In a way, ring-fencing aid immediately sets it up as a bit of a target. And to say that you're going to set the 0.7% of GDP, this long-standing, rather arbitrary figure, as a target which we will enshrine in law, that's to do with the politics of the coalition. It's not to do with aid.
You can see the argument. We can't build schools here, but we can afford to build a toilet block in a Mumbai slum. In India, a country that can afford a space programme, but we send them aid.
Although it's not an insignificant amount of money, compared with what we spend on benefits, on education, on health, it is relatively small. And if we took it away from the poor people in the world, it would be catastrophically bad for them. But spread thinly across the UK, that money would not be seen, and yet Britain's influence in the world would be diminished and our reputation would be seriously tarnished.
Nonetheless, our aid will now be heavily scrutinised when aid to countries that are corrupt or undemocratic has increased and continued to those some say don't need it. And now the focus is Afghanistan. Is our aid there part of subsidising conflicts, a subtle rebranding of aspects of security as aid?
Well, that was Giles. In a moment, we'll be speaking to the Development Minister, Alan Duncan. But first, I'm joined by Julian Harris from the International Policy Network think tank. And Barbara Stocking is still with us. Can I start with you, Julian? That point that was made in the film about ring fencing, does it make the budget a target?
I think it does. I mean, the budget's not just been ring-fencing, it's actually ring-fenced, it's actually being increased by several billion, which I think makes it even more of a target. I think people are not necessarily worried about a kind of us and them argument. I think people are concerned about whether aid actually works. And traditionally, we've seen really big problems with aid, with fueling particularly corrupt governments and even leaking out into war-torn areas. And therefore, especially increasing aid in an area like Afghanistan with huge problems in that area, especially when a large part of that budget goes direct to the government, I think is quite worrying.
Well, Barbara Stocking, I mean, Julian's point there, I mean, you said that it's not about a them and us situation, but for people where it is, that might be accentuated by the sort of economic times we're in now. They want to know even more and scrutinise more, and they're not getting the answer.
The scrutiny is absolutely fine, but we do need to go back to the point that the British people should be very proud of what has been done with British aid. Partly it gives us such a position in the world because actually governments have delivered on their promises, and that 0.7% is a promise. It's not just something that's been made up. It's been promised and committed to. But the other part is the British people have always been generous. You pointed it out on here, not just in their own pockets, but throughout the ages.
So why can't they do it themselves?
They can partly, but you also need a proper government deposit department that is putting money through.
Do you now need to, I mean, if you're saying they're so generous, they're so proud of what's been done, there is now very difficult problems here. And also, looking at countries like India and China, the point will be, and has been made already, emerging economies, do they really need our aid?
It's perfectly fair to scrutinise the aid that's going to countries like China and so on. It's also absolutely right that we get better methods in to manage corruption in those of the poorest and weakest countries. But the sort of money that the public can give to organisations like ours in an emergency is absolutely fantastic. But you also need the money that is truly coming from government. And the British people have always recognised that generosity, even at times of difficulty. The other point is, of course, we're not in a world where Britain sits on this island. We are part of a global world where all of the things that are happening, the poverty in Afghanistan, all knocks back into Britain as well.
And isn't that the important point? And that was echoed by Malcolm Bruce. Soft power is important. We're not isolated in that sense in the world, and it brings us other things, that aid too, that are important.
Well, I think it is good that people think as kind of global citizens, as the saying is, and they do care about development. But that's something very different from the government using aid as a political tool. And I think that can often be very dangerous. And then we mix up two things, supposed concern for poverty.
And you think it is used in that way?
Oh, absolutely. And Britain has tried to use aid before as a means to amend its foreign policy. I mean, in lots of post-colonial countries, such as Tanzania, heavily despotic, controlling leaders were propped up by government aid from countries like ourselves, which really stifled growth. And that's the kind of, I mean, if you look over a whole, really aid hasn't promoted development in the same way that trade has, in the way that building up liberal institutions has. And that's what we should really be doing instead.
Thank you.